Hey everybody, before we get started talking about the neutral density filter on the FUJI X100F, let me just remind you to please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and be sure and comment if you have any questions. I love to reply to comments. I love to learn just like you do, so be sure and comment below the video here if you have any questions or comments on what I'm talking about today. Be sure and check out my podcast, which is called Photobomb. It's been going on for 3 years now. Me and Gary Hughes do this podcast every week. I guarantee you will enjoy it. You can find it anywhere that podcasts are found. And join my group on Facebook, which is called Profoto Talk with Boo-Ray Perry, where we talk about photography. Oh, and also one more thing, just recently added a new page onto my website where I have listed every single piece of gear that I carry, not just the stuff that I carry with my Fuji when I travel, but also my pro photography gear. So if you're interested in pro photography and wedding photography, that's where you want to go to see all the gear that I carry, and it's on my website, boorayperry.com, under the Education tab. All right, let's talk about this great neutral density filter that is included with the FUJI X100F. It's actually built into the camera. So the thing about the small cameras is that they tend to have a shutter speed that's not quite as high as the shutter speed on some of your bigger pro-level DSLRs. So the maximum shutter speed on the FUJI X100F is 1/4000th of a second. And the maximum aperture on the lens is f2. So the most you're going to get in terms of opening that lens up and getting a shallow depth of field is f2. That's as much as you're going to get. And as fast as you're going to have that shutter speed move is 1/4000th of a second. Now on the Fuji, because it's a mechanical shutter, we'll talk about the electronic shutter in just a few minutes. Because it's a mechanical shutter, even though it's a small camera, they say that at f2, which is the widest possible opening, that it can't actually clear that opening in 1/4000th of a second. So if you're at f2, you really can only go up to 1/1000th of a second. Now, as you're going to see in a minute with a couple of examples, that doesn't actually seem to be the case all the time, because I can shoot at f2 in 1/4000th of a second, and you can see that the light level is definitely going down in the camera, and I'm not seeing the blades of the shutter in the picture. So I don't know what's happening there. I don't know if maybe Fuji automatically kicks it over to electronic shutter if you go to 1/4000th of a second or something like that. I don't know, but I do know that if you go to 2000th of a second or if you go to 4000th of a second, that the numbers will be red in the viewfinder. It's trying to tell you that you're not supposed to be at this level. It could just be that it actually does work that fast, but it's bad for the shutter. And they don't want you to use it at that speed. That may very well be the case, in which case maybe I'm sending my camera off to the shop again sometime soon. So the bottom line is you're only supposed to use it at 1/1000th of a second. So this puts us in a situation where we're shooting outdoors, it's very bright, and we want to have a super shallow depth of field. We want to shoot at f2, right? Well, the maximum shutter speed is going to be 1/1000th of a second. So if you set your maximum shutter speed to 1/1000th of a second, and you open up to f2, and you set your ISO to 200. Now you could go down to 100, but we're going to go 200 because that's where you're going to get the best dynamic range. And you set your ISO to 200, then this is the picture that you're going to get. And as you can see, this is a picture that's blown out because we're just getting too much light in the camera, because even at 1/1000th of a second, that f2 aperture is just letting in too much light. So for the purposes of this experiment, I went ahead and I went up to 1/2000th of a second. And you can see it cuts down the light. And then when I go up to 1/4000th of a second, it cuts down the light even more. But as I said, the manual tells you you're not supposed to do this. I suspect it's not very good for the shutter to do this. So then we've got the neutral density filter. This is a 3-stop neutral density filter. So if you go back to where we started, 1/1000th of a second, and you turn on the neutral density filter, this is what you get. And now if you go to 1/2000th of a second, you get this. And if you go to 1/4000th of a second, you get this. So as you can see, it makes a huge difference in how you can work with a shallow depth of field and a really wide open aperture in a bright situation. And this is really what the neutral density filter is for. Now, you might be saying to yourself, also I can use it with flash. Yes, you can. Now, if you're working with a flash and you want to use a neutral density filter, that's great because you want to have a shallow depth of field. That's great. Just keep in mind that the neutral density filter takes 3 stops of light off of every single light source. So it's not just going to take your background down 3 stops. It's also going to take your flash down 3 stops. So what does that mean? It means that your flash is going to have to be much more powerful to light your subject if you're using the neutral density filter. So, I mean, we can do the math on that, right? So 3 stops means 1 stop is twice as powerful. One stop is twice as powerful as that, so now you're looking at 4 flashes. And another stop is twice as powerful as that, so now you're looking at 8 flashes. So your flash has to be 8 times as powerful to light something with the neutral density filter on as it does to light that same subject without the neutral density filter. And if you're using a camera like the Fuji, a lot of times you don't have that much flash power to spare. There's going to be some times where it can work for you, don't get me wrong, but a lot of times you don't. So for me, with the neutral density filter, the main reason that I use it is when I'm shooting with natural light and I really want a shallow depth of field, and I can't get that shallow depth of field because the shutter speed simply won't go high enough for me. That's when I kick in the neutral density filter. And I have mine programmed to the FM button right here on the top of my camera, right here. So I can just pop it on real quick and then pop it off. You do have to be careful because sometimes you knock it on by mistake. So pay attention to the settings inside your viewfinder when you're looking. Make sure you don't have it on by mistake. Okay, so this brings us to the final question about the neutral density filter that people will ask. And that is, what about the electronic shutter? Right? The Fuji has an electronic shutter, and the electronic shutter goes crazy high, like 32 thousandths of a second or something along those lines. Here's the thing with an electronic shutter. It doesn't really go as high as you think it does. I mean, it goes that high in terms of what the exposure is going to be, but in terms of how long the shutter is open, it's not really that fast because an electronic shutter doesn't really open and close. You see, a mechanical shutter actually opens and closes. So if it's a 1/1000th of a second, it opens and closes in 1/1000th of a second. But the way that a mechanical shutter works, the way that an electronic shutter works is that the lines of pixels turn on and off, and they turn on and off in sequence. So instead of having it like this, it turns on the bottom line, turns them off, turns on the next line, turns them off, turns on the next line, turns them off, like that. Now, it may turn each individual line on and off at 10,000ths of a second, but it doesn't turn them all on and off at the same time. It does it in a sequence. And it takes about 1/15th of a second for that entire sequence to take place. Are you with me? So even though they're turning on and off really, really quick, they still have to do it in order. And that takes about 1/15th of a second. So what that means is, when you're taking a picture of something that's moving, like this ceiling fan, for example, if you take a picture of it with the electronic shutter at 4/1000ths of a second, you still are going to get this motion and this blur. Because even though each individual line turned on and off at 4/1000ths of a second, the entire sensor took 1/15th of a second to completely cycle through. Whereas if you use a mechanical shutter, that's not a problem. If you shoot at 4/1000ths of a second, it freezes the motion at 4/1000ths of a second. So using a mechanical shutter when you're taking pictures of fast motion and stuff like that doesn't really help that much. And the whole point in using the mechanical shutter is the fact that it has a really high shutter speed. And here, the thing that you really want a really high shutter speed for, you can't use the electronic shutter. I meant electronic shutter. We're talking about the electronic shutter. And another problem you can have with the electronic shutter is that because of this rolling, it can have a problem dealing with certain light sources. I don't have an example to show you, but for example, fluorescent lights flicker. And it's called a rolling shutter. The rolling shutter of the electronic shutter can make these flickers very obvious in your picture. So there are some advantages to using the electronic shutter. It's completely silent. Really not a problem with the FUJI X100F because the leaf shutter is so silent to begin with. There's no mechanical moving parts, so it's not going to wear your camera out. But the downside is it doesn't always work with things that are moving fast. It can work really weird with lights. And those downsides are so big that I just never use the electronic shutter ever. I always stick with the mechanical. So if you're always using the mechanical shutter, having this built-in 3-stop neutral density filter can be a real lifesaver if you're trying to do something creative with a shallow depth of field and really bright light. So that's it. That's the neutral density filter on the FUJI X100F. It's not so hard to understand. Don't forget, leave a comment below and be sure and subscribe to the channel too. And I'll be back soon with more videos. Thanks for watching.